For 25 years, Paul Kelly has written on Australian and international issues. He's interviewed some of the world's most influential and important people, and in Australia he's covered the governments of Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke, Keating and Howard. He is the author of 6 successful books, including The Dismissal and The End of Certainty. He presented the 2001 5-part television documentary for the ABC on Australian history and character, 100 Years, The Australian Story, and wrote a book with the same title. In 2003, he co-edited Hard Heads, Soft Hearts, a new domestic reform agenda for Australia. Paul Kelly has written widely on international affairs in America, Europe and Asia. A Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, he is currently Adjunct Professor of Journalism at the University of Queensland and a participant in the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. In 2002, he was a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School of Government and a visiting lecturer at the Weatherhead Centre for International Affairs at Harvard University. We're very pleased and proud to welcome him here today to give the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library's annual Anniversary Lecture. An Australian Vision, Foreign Policy Changes in the 21st Century. Please welcome Mr. Paul Kelly.
It's an honour for me to deliver the annual John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Lecture, not just because of Curtin's unique place in our history, but also because of the Australians who have performed this task in the past. Some, such as Gough Whitlam, Paul Keating and Kim Beazley, shared with Curtin the singular experience of the ALP leadership. All I can share is the modest bond of a fellow journalist. I do note, however, Jeff Searle's view that Curtin as Prime Minister had turbulent relations with media proprietors, but was rarely disillusioned with the senior political journalists. This suggests an astute tolerance. Curtin is a politician I would have liked very much to have met. This is my entry point to make a personal acknowledgement today to Gough Whitlam, a great supporter of this library. As a young journalist who covered the Whitlam government, I was 25 years old in 1972. I want to pay tribute to Gough. He taught all of us so much. His government left many monuments, but above all, it changed the way we thought, not just about our own country, but about ourselves as Australians. Being with Gough was an invitation to fresh hopes and greater possibilities in life. It wasn't inevitable that Whitlam's optimism and idealism would touch those whose job it was to report him, but they did touch me. And this Whitlam-inspired legacy has been in my life ever since. I think we should sometimes say these things to one another. So Gough, thank you. In this lecture, I'm discussing Australia's role in the world, but I want to begin with some observations first about John Curtin. Curtin never thought of himself as a hero, and he is indeed a most unlikely hero. A war leader who in many ways was unqualified to lead in wartime. When Curtin became Prime Minister, he had had no ministerial experience. He was prone to black moods of depression. He was an anti-conscriptionist in an age of total warfare, and he had no claims as an international statesman when Australia's fate depended upon global strategy. My point is that Curtin is fascinating for who he was, not just for what he did. His story involved a personal transformation from revolutionary agitator to wartime leader in conditions more demanding than those confronting any other Prime Minister. It was a very Australian journey, how an ordinary man can achieve extraordinary things and in the process come to be deemed as extraordinary himself. Jeff Searle's assessment of Curtin is surely correct. The justification for his prime ministership is that nobody else could have done the job. However, like all leaders, Curtin is judged by his achievements. He governed during the decisive phase of our first century. The Second World War was the pivotal event in our first 100 years as a nation, and Curtin's leadership operated at this point. Curtin was both a negotiator of Australia's wartime survival and a socio-economic designer of a new Australia. It is largely to Curtin's credit that Australia, divided and demoralised after World War I, emerged from World War II with a sense of national strength and purpose, a very different legacy. The Labor Party owes a great debt to Curtin. It was Curtin who proved for the first time that Labor could govern Australia during a crisis and remain a united and effective force. It was Curtin who prevailed where Hughes in World War I and Scullin in the Depression had succumbed in their different ways. Curtin's integrity and moral standing was vital to his wartime success. The more one studies Curtin, the more striking is this quality. His ability to win the trust and respect of colleagues, advisors, and even opponents was one of his greatest political assets. Consider his rise to power. Curtin spent 6 lonely years as opposition leader. While declining to serve in a wartime government of national unity, as repeatedly offered by Prime Minister Menzies, Curtin nevertheless resisted the campaign by other senior Labor figures to bring down the Menzies government. Curtin's approach was to assist the war effort through the Advisory War Council on which Labor served and to prepare his own party for office. This tactic was rewarded in October 1941 after the 2 independents which switched their support to Labor and Curtin became Prime Minister, with an acceptance that he was the only viable option for the nation. His judgment, patience and timing were vindicated. He was a leader prepared to take power but not to seize it prematurely, a rare quality. After Menzies resigned as Prime Minister, he wrote this letter to Curtin. My dear John, I've ceased to be Prime Minister and we shall therefore no longer be opposite members at the table. I want to thank you for 2 years and 4 months in which my task, always difficult, has frequently been rendered easier and at times rendered more tolerable by your magnanimous and understanding attitude. Your political opposition has been honourable and your personal friendship a pearl of great price. Yours sincerely, Bob. It's a most unusual tribute by a vanquished Prime Minister of his opponent. It tells us much about Menzies and even more about Curtin. There's no more extraordinary event in Curtin's story than how the anti-conscription leader of World War I became the architect of overseas conscription for military service in World War II. The transition reveals Curtin's adaptability and judgment. Curtin's reversal on conscription is a template of how the war changed Australia. The conventional wisdoms of 1914-18 could no longer be accepted. Curtin saw that even the most sacred orthodoxies exist to be slain. His timing was superb and he outmanoeuvred his political opponents. Paul Hasluck concluded that Curtin had come through the criticism of the opposition with more public credit for his party than the opposition had gained for itself. This was Curtin's real triumph over Billy Hughes. He introduced conscription for overseas service, kept his Labor government united, outsmarted his Conservative opponents, and won a great election victory in 1943. In the process, Curtin provided an insight into Labor success. that Labor exists not to offer slavish obedience to any position or policy, but to adapt to new situations that confront the nation. It's been the hallmark of all the best ALP leaders. Australia now lives in a time of upheaval in global power, in the nature of threat, and in the rules of the international system. The feature of the 21st century is that opportunities have not been as great, nor have the risks been as unpredictably complex. The paradox of our times is the rise of a technology-driven globalisation, simultaneous with a trans-regional jihad that denies the democracy and diversity of the modern state. This situation demands from Australians that they think harder about their role in the world. There is a vacuum in this country about Australia's purpose. Are we Europeans shipwrecked on the wrong side of Earth in a bizarre historical mishap? Or are we able to construct a national meaning for ourselves and make a worthwhile contribution to the world? This is a question that one of our great historians, Manning Clark, confronted, but did not answer. I think because he felt that Australians had no answer. Australia likes to think of itself as an independent nation, no longer imprisoned within a colonial mentality. Our national psychology applauds this liberation, but does not fully comprehend its consequences, the extent of the challenge facing a freestanding Australia, and the magnitude of the opportunities to be taken. We need to examine the world as it exists and not the world of our dreams. Let us list some of the strategic realities for Australia. First, we have a significant issue of scale. A nation of just 20 million in an East Asia that will be defined by China, India, Indonesia, Japan and Korea. The structural trend seems unmistakable. Over time, our population and GDP will diminish in relative terms within this region. We face a major challenge to maintain our standing and our influence. Secondly, unlike the situation facing most other middle powers, there is no political or regional economic union for Australia to join. Australia will not join the European Union. It will not become a state of the United States. It will never become merely an extension of the United States economy, nor share a land border with the United States, such as Canada does. It will not be accepted as a fully fledged Asian member into any subsequently created East Asian Union. In short, it will not find safety in numbers by trading away sovereignty to join a political federation. Australia's destiny will be determined as a freestanding nation. We live in a region of the world where dislocation is on the rise. East Asia encompasses unresolved power rivalries fueled by centuries-old antagonisms. The region must manage and incorporate the rise of China, a final settlement on the Korean Peninsula, and the internal tensions within Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim nation. The civil war within Islam is likely to run for decades, and the 2002 Bali attack confirms that Australia is deeply entangled in this struggle. The South Pacific is beset by state failure. Witness the recent crises in Fiji and Solomon Islands, and alarm about systemic decline in Papua New Guinea. Southeast Asia will see rising Islamic militancy, weak central governments, and growing secessionist disputes. The Howard government's year 2000 Defence White Paper said that Australia cannot be secure in an insecure region, yet our own region is becoming more insecure. Finally, as a freestanding middle power, Australia is exposed to the full force of globalisation. I think this is a good thing. In the globalised world, relative economic power is changing faster than ever before. The consequences of nations getting things wrong, witness Thailand and Indonesia in the Asian financial crisis, are worse than before. And the dividends that flow from getting things right witness Ireland and Australia itself over the past 15 years, can be immense. Globalisation also demands the management of multifaceted change. There's not much point being a superior high-tech player if your financial system is broken, witness Japan, or a major resources producer if you are prone to systemic failure, witness Argentina, or being the world's biggest oil producer if you are a dysfunctional society that breeds terrorists, witness Saudi Arabia. One law of the globalised age is that you are only as strong as your weakest link. Given this overall strategic environment, how should Australia respond? How should Australia see itself? In this lecture, I want to offer 5 benchmarks for our conduct in the 21st century. And the first benchmark refers to our core strength. Our core strength lies in what we have created: a tolerant, unified, multicultural and multiracial democracy. This is the vision, it's the light that we must offer to the world. It's a beacon that will become more important as the secular multicultural state faces lethal challenges from the caves of history and internal tensions force the disintegration of more nations. The Australian vision is often expressed as the idea of unity in diversity, and this can become a model. When we sometimes lapse from this aspiration, and we do, we need to keep the magnitude of our own failures in perspective. But I think our overall success has been remarkable. This is a path between an outdated monoculture on the one hand and a diversity that might degenerate into a nation of tribes on the other. Nations that find the middle path will be the best place to manage the coming century. As barriers between foreign and domestic policy dissolve, we will see the rise of what's called soft power. This term, as defined by its inventor, Harvard University's Joe Nye Jr., refers to how a country may obtain the outcomes it wants in world politics because other countries want to follow it. It co-opts people rather than coerces them. The dilemma, for example, the United States faces in the Muslim world, and the answer to the question, why do they hate us, must involve soft power answers. Perhaps Australia's single greatest soft power dividend has been the provision of university places for so many years for students from Asia. Other recent successes were our hosting of the 2000 Sydney Olympics and our leadership of the United Nations force in East Timor. However, under the Howard government, Australia has largely failed to construct an effective soft power strategy, a legacy of Hansonism, refugee policy and bitter cultural divisions at home that are transmitted abroad. Our most important psychological transition has been the shift from an isolationist to a cosmopolitan mindset. This transition is not complete, but it is far advanced. The old idea that Australia's uniqueness lay in its purity by separation from the world of its race and its democracy has surrendered to the idea that we must be joined to and benchmarked against the world to succeed. Our 21st century social vision, first and last, is this creation of a pluralistic democracy that is a constructive global citizen. The second benchmark I want to nominate is the need for a clearer economic vision for Australia. This vision is implicit in our polity over the last generation, but it is not embraced by our people as such. The logic of our situation means that Australia must become a state-of-the-art exemplar of making globalisation work in our favour. We have no other option. We need to turn the non-availability of membership of a political or economic union into a plus. That means running an open, deregulated and competitive economy integrated into regional and global markets. The protectionist impulse is wounded, but not yet buried. It's precisely because we are not an Italy or a California embedded in a massive and genuine free market that we have to work harder at these tasks. The challenge begins with a recognition that our economic interests are truly global. Looking at our top trading partners, the EU constitutes 18% of our trade, the United States 15%, and Northeast Asia 26%. Japan will remain our major trading partner until it is replaced by China. Australia is absorbing a lesson of the globalised age. Open economies create networks of global stakeholders. We have global interests and we have regional priorities. This dictates a trade policy that promotes liberalisation and tries to ensure that markets are not closed against us. The approach of the Howard government in seeking to operate at bilateral, regional and multilateral level seems well-based. It is starting to produce dividends. An FTA with the United States, with Singapore, with Thailand, the opening of new trade talks with ASEAN, and efforts to secure the Doha multilateral round. However, the economic message is starting to lose traction at home. We must renew the idea that economic progress and a just society go together, because they do. This requires policies at home that spread widely the dividends of growth. It's vital because the limits to our influence in the world will be imposed by our economic performance. We need to build upon the stellar results of the past 20 years since the opening up of our economy. However, the case for economic reform is rarely argued today, and the power of this idea is at risk. The result of a short-term political focus, the role of the Senate, pressure from sectional interest groups, and the view that economic reform is killing Australian egalitarianism. At the same time, Australia has failed to realise fully the nexus between productivity and investment in education and innovation. Our knowledge nation train only travels at half speed. Australia needs to redefine the economic agenda that has transformed outside perceptions of our country. We cannot succeed in the 21st century without this successful economic vision. The third benchmark that I want to highlight is the strategic decision we face about whether Australia becomes a growing or shrinking nation. There is probably no more important decision facing the rich nations in the 21st century. The ANU's Professor Ross Garnaut argues that in the 21st century, rich nations will divide into two camps, most with declining and ageing populations facing the risk of economic stagnation, and a small number, led by the United States, that takes the path of population growth and immigration. For Australia, it is between the option of staying relatively young and the European twilight of decline. A brand of false prophets has arisen who preach literally an environmental doomsday. They invoke science, but they are best seen as religious fundamentalists. They demand that we convert and act according to their own environmental credo of salvation or damnation. Prominent environmentalist Tim Flannery, who once spoke of reducing this country to a population of between 6 and 12 million, now warns of a crisis with no apparent solution. Let me stress that I am not denying serious problems, and I am not opposed to environmentally sustainable policies. Indeed, this is exactly what I support, an environmental response to environmental problems, not shrinking our population with all its consequences. A growing Australia is the sound moral option and the self-interested option. This is a situation where morality and self-interest coincide. We need to beware the coalition between the populist Hansonite right and the pro-environmentalist left that wants to reverse the past 60 years of our history and see Australia onto a trajectory of zero or declining population growth. A stronger Australia will be a stronger force for good in the world. One of our leading economists, Max Corden, says, "I have no doubt that Australia's influence, whether in the region or in the world, would increase if it were a substantially larger economy, able to provide more funds in aid, in contributions to international organisations or in joint international action. There are many ways in which other countries can benefit or harm us, and also many ways in which we can do some good in the world, if that is our desire. It sounds like a good Labor position to me, wanting a more influential Australia that is a greater force for good. The fourth benchmark I want to nominate is that our engagement with Asia should become a permanent national project, a project that transcends the detail of foreign policy. Our engagement with Asia is a condition of national existence. It is about bringing our history and our geography into harmony, given our non-Indigenous origins as a European nation on the rim of East Asia. This is a great enterprise. The word engagement is crucial. Engagement implies a dynamic process, a relationship leading to mutual obligation and growing intimacy. Engagement, of course, cannot succeed without reciprocity. Within Australia, the policy of Asian engagement is bipartisan, the objective of Liberal and Labor governments. While Labor attacks the Howard government for weakening our position in Asia, Foreign Minister Downer argues the reverse, that our engagement with Asia has actually grown in terms of trade, security and diplomacy. The real point here is that both sides accept the test of engagement and want to be judged by it. There has, however, been a counterproductive culture war reflected in the Howard and Keating schools about the meaning of engagement. Paul Keating said that engagement was not just an expression of what Australia did, but of what Australia is. He argued that engagement was dependent upon Australia escaping its past, that the more we embraced Aboriginal reconciliation, a republic and multiculturalism, the more we would succeed in Asia. John Howard, by contrast, was not interested in cultural adaptation. He dismissed any notion that Australia had to change itself further to succeed in Asia. He said that Australia would succeed in Asia by being itself and not by pretending to be somebody else. Let me make a couple of points about this counterproductive culture war. I think it's a mistake for Australia to impose as conditions of our engagement major reforms that do not relate directly to Asia. After all, in Asia, there are monarchies and there are societies that do not accept our multiculturalism. It was Paul Keating who did remind us, we can only go to Asia as we are. On the other hand, we cannot engage the region successfully without a credible commitment to the study of its culture, its languages and its history. And to embark seriously on this commitment is to change ourselves. It has already, and it will further do so. We need to recognise that engagement will have its bad days as well as its good days. It should transcend both economic miracles and regional financial crises. The region over time will come to understand the depth of Australia's commitment. We should approach Asia neither as a supplicant seeking entry nor as an outsider without valid claims. It's best to remember some rules. Asia is diverse and does not think with one mind. Engagement does not exclude Australia from taking decisions that might upset the region. However, we need to think of ourselves as a partner with the responsibility that being a partner involves. Our ability to relate to the region will be a national interest test for every Prime Minister. For Australia, engagement is a project with no end. It demands patience and resolution. It exists to be interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation. My final benchmark, my fifth benchmark, is the most contentious and an issue close to Curtin's own career, the United States alliance. I believe that the alliance is entering a new phase as a result of the changed position of America in the international order. For most of its history, the Australia-United States relationship was shaped by the Second World War and the Cold War. The current period is defined by epic new developments. The United States is now an unrivaled global hegemon, enjoying what is often called the unipolar moment. Being allied to a global hegemon is very different from being allied to the United States in the Pacific War or in the Cold War. There are advantages in being associated with the United States power, but there are risks, because a hegemon is bound to be disliked, and its status will provoke coalitions to be organised against it. More important, however, is the war against terrorism, on which the United States has embarked after September 2001. This attack on the United States has inaugurated a new semi-permanent asymmetrical warfare with an elusive enemy of global Islamic militants inspired by a religious fanaticism and pledged to political revolution within Islamic nations, a campaign against Christians and Jews, and vanquishing American power. September the 11th violated America in a way that is not comprehended in this country. George W. Bush says this is not a clash of civilizations or a war against Islam, but this is exactly what Osama bin Laden and his followers want, and the more their interpretation is accepted within Islam, the greater will be their victory. This conflict, sure to be long and unpredictable, will outlast Bush and Osama bin Laden. The fundamental and unanswered question for Australia is whether the war on terrorism unites the interests of Australia and the United States to the same extent that our interests were united in World War II and the Cold War. Now, I imagine the answer to this question will be yes, but that answer is still not clear. The United States alliance must operate as a positive for Australia in Southeast Asia. Any sense that the alliance was a liability for Australia within our own region, within our own part of the world, would be very damaging. The lesson of the 2002 Bali bombing is that Australians at home and abroad are targets. This is a change in our situation. We now have a security crisis on our doorstep. That has dictated a new range of cooperation between Australia and Southeast Asian nations. The assistance of the United States, notably its intelligence, has been vital in combating regional terrorism. But Australia, as I said, needs to ensure that our United States ties are an overall positive in this task. This means we cannot let the impression develop that we are merely a regional agent for the United States or a deputy sheriff. One of the Howard government's worst mistakes was to give currency to this notion. It is not only a liability within Asia, but unacceptable within Australia. It will not be easy for Australia to intensify its counter-terrorism agenda within the region, yet simultaneously offer military support for the United States' global war on terrorism outside our region. This constitutes a new and serious long-term challenge for our alliance with the United States. However, the greatest single strain on our US relations arises from President Bush's embrace of a revolutionary strategic doctrine that now bears his name. The Bush doctrine envisages that the United States, if necessary, will act on a unilateral and preemptive basis against terrorists. Iraq was presented as the test case in relation to action against rogue states that seek to develop a WMD capacity. This reveals an America in a strange mindset of invincibility and vulnerability. Within its government, the fear of a WMD attack is pervasive. The bottom line of the security seminars that I attended at Harvard University 2 years ago is that America faces a serious risk, more than a 50% chance of a WMD attack on a major city within 8 to 10 years. The significance of September the 11th is to reduce America's threshold of threat tolerance. This is a permanent change and will endure under future Republican or Democrat administrations. There is no return to the pre-September the 11th world, and it would be a mistake for Australians to think post-Bush that this could happen. For United States allies, the critical issue is America's conduct in this new era of uncertainty. Australia's interests are clear. We want a strong America that displays prudence, wisdom, and sound judgment. The trauma of Iraq should provoke a rethink within the United States about its approach. There are signs this rethink has begun. It should be welcomed by Australia. My view is that Iraq is more likely the end of a 20-year chapter of American history rather than the start of a new chapter of United States military interventions. Australia's interest is to see that America understands the limits to its power, is to see an America that recognises it must work in partnership with its allies and with Islamic nations to achieve its security objectives, and an America that supports the global institutions such as the United Nations. We need to encourage this sort of America. The debate in Australia since the 11th of September, I believe, has been flawed. It has fluctuated between an uncritical acceptance of Bush's policies and an irrational anti-Americanism. This is a time when we need to think deeply and carefully about these complex global events and draw firm conclusions. In outlining my own conclusions, I would invoke Curtin. He knew that alliances are essential to Australia's life as a middle power. He saw no conflict between being an authentic Australian nationalist and being a champion of close ties with the United States. He was interested in results, not appearance. He was never deluded into thinking our link with America was a relationship of equals, but he did demand a relationship based upon respect. He would have dismissed as frivolous any notion that Australia did not need great allies. He knew the task of Australian statecraft was to extract the best concessions for Australia from Washington and London. He was realistic about America and never fooled himself into thinking that it was defending Australia out of altruism. Curtin knew the test. The only test to be applied was the national interest. We know this because when the time came, he famously defied our oldest ally and stared down Winston Churchill, who sought to divert the Australian division to Burma, a move that would have denied its service for the defence of Australia. That should stand as an enduring example of behaviour for all our Prime Ministers. The case against America's involvement in Iraq last year was persuasive. The strategic case against the war only looks stronger now. But Iraq will fade into history and the alliance will move on to new agendas. The greatest of these for Australia will be to harmonise our ties with the US and our growing links with China. Our national interest in Iraq was marginal. Our national interest in China is immense. Australia must aspire to influence the strategic climate in East Asia and relations between Beijing and Washington. The worst outcome from Australia's perspective would be for America to interpret its Asian mission as being a strict containment of China. This would imply the attempted recruitment of America's regional allies, such as Australia, into a containment strategy, threatening the region with a wider US-China tension or conflict. The nightmare scenario for Australia is being forced to choose between America or China, particularly if responsibility for any tension or conflict was seen to rest mainly with Washington. This could constitute an alliance-breaking event. Australia must decline any such choice. This underlines the need for management of alliance expectations. There is no disposition within Australia for a military role against China. The US needs to know this, and know this in relation to Taiwan. Australia's bipartisan view is that Taiwan enjoys a democratic autonomy. There is no reason why any Australian should die to convert Taiwan's de facto independence into de jure independence. Australia's view is that China should seek a non-military solution to the Taiwan issue and that the US and Taiwan should avoid provocation in the near term to achieve a managed solution in the longer term. In conclusion, it is a welcome sign of Australia's belated consciousness of its own history that the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library exists as an archive to encourage awareness of Curtin and our political past. My message to the library and its dedicated staff is that they are swimming with the tide. Australians have an abiding interest in their own history, their ancestral stories and their nation's evolution. This interest is greater than recognised by our media. I know this from personal experience because during the 1990s, as Editor-in-Chief of The Australian, I devoted considerable resources to a series of historical specials. They included war anniversaries such as Kokoda, our immigration program, a retrospective popular history on the Beatles' trip to Australia, and a special on the 50th anniversary of Curtin's death. The message I gave our management was that history works, and the reason it works is because it connects people and offers a frame of reference by which they can understand their own present. Only a blinkered pessimist could see Australian history as dull. That would misjudge the epic experiment underway on this continent. Curtin was central to our experiment, and I've enjoyed very much this chance to reflect upon him and our current challenges. Thank you.
As was stated before, it was my task, as it frequently is, to present the vote of thanks for this lecture. And one of the advantages of this, I thought, that I was presented with a copy of the speech this morning. And when I started to read it and read about Curtin and so on, it was interesting and challenging, and I thought, this is good. I'll be able to sort this out in a few minutes. But I was, in fact, quite wrong, because, in fact, Paul Kelly, as you've heard, has led us into a labyrinth and has made me realise that the world that I am talking in now is not the world that I was brought up in and not the world I used to teach about when I first came to Curtin. When I first came to Curtin, I can well remember stating from numerous textbooks as my source that Australia was a country of settled policies, that since the beginning of the century that we had answered many questions, it was just a case of implementing them. That we had things like the White Australia policy, we had things like the total reliance on the British Navy and British power, we had tariff protection, which was established very early in the century, we had centralised arbitration system and this concept of the basic wage, etc., etc. And these were basically the issues that were being debated and talked about in various forms, but they were fundamental to our way of life. When I was studying politics at UWA, that we used a book by Bruce Miller, who informed us that Australian political parties were in fact fairly narrow economic syndicates, that the Labor, Liberal and Country parties respectively represented different vocational groups, and that was their main job, and that there was a, to quote Miller, a lack of interest in wider questions. And by wider questions, they obviously meant things like foreign policy and all the sorts of issues we've been hearing about today. Now, when we get to the 1970s and 80s and 90s, despite the challenges that come from the Whitlam government and others, many of those old truths have lingered on. But what this address we've heard today has made clear to us is that the world we are dealing with now, that all these kind of solutions, if they were once appropriate, no longer are. But of course, the real essence of this lecture today has been the challenge and attempt to understand this enormously complex and difficult world that we're in. The issues of population growth. I've been pondering the same issue within the Federation, that Western Australia's share of population is growing rapidly, along with Queensland, and what's this going to mean to the balance of power in the future? The notion of dislocation, of fundamental ideas, the notions of globalisation and so on. And I was particularly intrigued, as I'm sure many of us were, by the concept of a soft power. Geoffrey Bolton, I well remember in the book The Middle of Australia, suggesting that one of the features of Australian life was that somehow we presented a world that people wanted to be like. That many parts of the world would like to think that some of the values we had somehow incorporated with the values they would like to take on as well. And the notion, for example, that we could create some kind of democracy which really had something to offer is tremendously important and makes it all the more important that what we do is really worth emulating and something to want. Which values do we preserve? And Paul has raised for us the fundamental issues raised by the economic transformation that's taking place. Can we be a just society built on growth? Seeing Sir Charles here, for example, reminds me again of the debate and yet the enormous importance of the whole concept of economic growth and what it means as to whether it is in fact an essential underpinning of other values. And how this fits with environment is another enormous task that we are being confronted with now. So I think what we've had today has been a very important and extremely challenging talk. An attempt to convince me that the world that I'm now facing is much more difficult and complex, and the choices being made by politicians are much, much harder than they probably were when I was a small boy. But it also convinces me that John Curtin was beginning to make just those kind of choices. We're very grateful for Paul Kelly for reminding us of that, and we're extremely grateful to him for the marvellous lecture he's given us this afternoon. Please join with me in showing our appreciation.